Hi, now let's take a look at exposure. Simply put, exposure is the amount of light allowed to hit the sensor in your camera. The controls for exposure are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO value. A photo can basically be overexposed, underexposed, or properly exposed. An overexposed image will suffer a loss in detail in the brighter areas and appear bright white and somewhat washed out. An underexposed image will appear too dark and will have a loss of detail in the darker areas of the image. Proper exposure will have good balance of brightness across all areas of the photo. Details will appear clear in both the dark and bright areas. The camera's internal light meter will judge the amount of light entering the camera and give you a recommended exposure. In most cameras, the meter display is located at the bottom of the viewfinder. At its most basic, achieving proper exposure is a matter of aligning the marker on the meter to the center of the display by adjusting your shutter speed or your aperture. The meter in most cameras will look something like this. In an underexposed image, the green marker is left of center. In an overexposed image, the marker is on the right. When the image is properly exposed, the marker will be in the center of the meter. With partial, spot, or center-weighted meter settings, a good way to properly expose your image is to aim the selected autofocus point at the area you wish to expose for and press the shutter button halfway. The meter will use that autofocus point as the area to measure brightness. You then select your aperture and shutter speed and recompose the shot to the picture you want to take. This ensures that you're not metering for the wrong part of the picture. So which do you adjust first, shutter or aperture? If you think of shutter as controlling motion and aperture as controlling focus, then the type of shot you're about to take will dictate which to give priority to. If shooting a scene with fast motion, shutter speed is the priority. To freeze the action and get a sharp image, choose the fastest speed possible, then set your f-stop accordingly. Unfortunately, with fast shutter speeds, you will need a very wide aperture, and in low light, you may need to increase your ISO value in order to get the fast shutter speed that you want. This was shot with a fast shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second at f3.5. The ISO value is set to a reasonably high 3200. This photo was taken at 1/5000th of a second at f3.2 and again at a fairly high ISO of 3200. To achieve a time-lapse or blurring effect, choose a slow shutter speed. Here's a couple of examples. This was shot at 1/4 of a second at f22 and an ISO of 400. Here, an even longer shot of 4 seconds creates an interesting effect with the taillights of a passing car. For photos that require more control of focus, aperture is the priority. For a shallow depth of field, you want to select a very low aperture value. Here's a shot with a very shallow depth of field, shot at f2.8. Notice the soft out-of-focus background. The same image, taken with a higher aperture value, will give a larger depth of field. Notice that the background in this photo is much sharper than the previous one. This is shot at f32. Your ISO setting can give you a greater latitude with exposure. If your image is already underexposed, but you can't choose a slower shutter speed and your aperture is already wide open, try increasing the ISO value. This makes the sensor more sensitive to light and works effectively like increasing the amount of light entering the camera. In another example, if you want a more shallow depth of field, try decreasing your ISO value. This will allow you to open your aperture more, giving you nice soft backgrounds. But remember, it's always important to shoot with the lowest ISO value you can to prevent noise and grain in your photos. With long exposures, generally slower than 1/60th of a second, camera shake can cause blurry images. For a more accurate guide to how slow a shutter you can use, see the reciprocal rule in the focus section of this course. So, to explain camera shake, imagine this canvas as the sensor in your camera, and this marker as the beam of light. When you're shooting handheld with slow shutter speeds, the camera tends to move around, and the light hitting the sensor will blur. So, if you stabilize the image by putting your camera on a tripod or shooting at faster shutter speeds, the light doesn't get the chance to move around the sensor and blur and gives you nice sharp points. So anything you can do to stabilize the camera will help. Here's a shot taken handheld at 1/6th of a second. Notice the blurry image. Here's the same shot mounted on a tripod at the same shutter speed of 1/6th of a second and with the self-timer on. Turning the self-timer on further reduces camera shake by allowing you to remove your hands from the camera when taking the picture. As a safety measure, you can try what's called bracketing. For every proper exposure you take 2 more shots. One f-stop overexposed and the other 1 f-stop underexposed. This will ensure that you've probably got the right exposure in situations where maybe a very dark or very bright area of the photo is confusing your camera meter. So, this is a quick look at exposure. Remember that shutter and aperture have a direct effect on each other. High aperture values will require slower shutter speeds, whereas low aperture values will allow for faster shutter speeds. Experiment with different combinations of these and your ISO setting. It's a great way to get to know your camera and to learn how it will perform in different situations and different lighting conditions.